Good morning, scholars. I'm going to continue reading from our text today, pages 56 through 65 of Night by Elie Wiesel. And as we read, you can find your copy of the reading if you need it to answer the questions on Edpuzzle in your Google Classroom under classwork and night readings all. We'll use both night reading 5 and night reading 6 today. I'm going to scroll to page 56 and then get started reading. Just a warning about today. There is some violence and death mentioned and explained in detail. And so there will be some questions that ask you to reflect on that and just really take in what's happening to Ellie, as this is a true story, something that really happened to real people. There's also a mention of sex during this time. It's not explicit, but if there are any kids around, you may want to move them away while you're reading. Ellie says, "A few days before the Poles left, I had a novel experience. It was on a Sunday morning, and our commando was not required to work that day. Only Adek would not hear of staying in the camp. We had to go to the depot. The sudden enthusiasm for work astonished us. At the depot, Idek entrusted us to Frenek, saying, 'Do what you like, but do something, or else you'll hear from me.' And he disappeared. We didn't know what to do. Tired of huddling on the ground, we each took turns, strolling through the warehouse in the hope of finding something, a piece of bread perhaps, that a civilian might have forgotten there. When I reached the back of the building, I heard sounds coming from an adjoining small room. I moved closer and had a glimpse of Idek and a young Polish girl, half naked on a straw mat. Now I understood why Idek refused to leave us in the camp. He moved 100 prisoners so that he could copulate with this girl. It struck me as terribly funny, and I burst out laughing. Idek turned and saw me, and while the girl tried to cover up her breasts, I wanted to run away, but my feet were nailed to the floor. Idek grabbed me by the throat. Hissing at me, he threatened, 'Just you wait, kid. You will see what it costs to leave your work. You'll pay for this later, and now go back to your place.' A half hour before the usual time to stop work, the capo assembled the entire commando. Roll call. Nobody understood what was going on. A roll call at this hour, here, only I knew. The capo made a short speech. 'An ordinary inmate does not have the right to mix into other people's affairs. One of you does not seem to understand this point. I shall therefore try to make him understand clearly once and for all.' I felt the sweat running down my back. A7713. I stepped forward. 'A crate,' he ordered. They brought a crate. 'Lie down on it, on your belly.' I obeyed. I no longer felt anything except the lashes of the whip. 1, 2, he was counting. He took his time between the lashes. Only the first really hurt. I heard him count. 10, 11. His voice was calm and reached me as through a thick wall. 23. 2 more, I thought, half unconscious. The capo was waiting. 24. 25. It was over. I had not realized it, but I had fainted. I came to when they doused me with cold water. I was still lying on the crate. In a blur, I could see the wet ground next to me. Then I heard someone yell. It had to be the capo. I began to distinguish what he was shouting. 'Stand up!' I must have made some movement to get up, but I felt myself fall back onto the crate. How I wanted to get up. 'Stand up!' He was yelling even more loudly. If only I could answer him. If only I could tell him that I could not move, but my mouth would not open. At Idek's command, 2 inmates lifted me and led me to him. 'Look me in the eye.' I looked at him without seeing him. I was thinking of my father. He would be suffering more than I. 'Listen to me, you son of a swine,' said Idek coldly. 'So much for your curiosity. You shall receive 5 times more if you dare tell anyone what you saw. Understood?' I nodded once, 10 times, endlessly, as if my head had decided to say yes for all eternity. One Sunday, as half of our group, including my father, was at work, the others, including me, took the opportunity to stay and rest. Around 10 o'clock, the siren started to go off. Alert. The blockadellist gathered us inside the blocks while the SS took refuge in the shelters. As it was relatively as it was relatively easy to escape during an alert, the guards left the watchtowers and the electric current in the barbed wire was cut. The standing order to the SS was to shoot anyone found outside the block. In no time, the camp had the look of an abandoned ship. No living soul in the alleys. Next to the kitchen, 2 cauldrons of hot, steaming soup had been left untended. 2 cauldrons of soup! Smack in the middle of the road, 2 cauldrons of soup with no one to guard them. A royal feast going to waste. Supreme temptation. Hundreds of eyes were looking at them, shining with desire. 2 lambs with hundreds of wolves lying in wait for them. 2 lambs without a shepherd, free for the taking. But who would dare? Fear was greater than hunger. Suddenly we saw the door of Block 37 open slightly. A man appeared, crawling snake-like in the direction of the cauldrons. Hundreds of eyes were watching his every move. Hundreds of men were crawling with him, scraping their bodies with his on the stones. All hearts trembled, but mostly with envy. He was the one who had dared. He reached the first cauldron. Hearts were pounding harder. He had succeeded us. Jealousy devoured us. It consumed us. We never thought to admire him. Poor hero committing suicide for a ration or 2 or more of soup. In our minds, he was already dead. Lying on the ground near the cauldron, he was trying to lift himself to the cauldron's rim. Either out of weakness or out of fear, he remained there, undoubtedly to muster his strength. At last, he succeeded in pulling himself up to the rim. For a second, he seemed to be looking at himself in the soup, looking for his ghostly reflection there. Then, for no apparent reason, he let out a terrible scream, a death rattle such as I had never heard before. And with open mouth, thrust his head toward the still steaming liquid. We jumped at the sound of the shot. Falling to the ground, his face stained by the soup, the man writhed a few seconds at the base of the cauldron, and then he was still. That was when we began to hear the planes. Almost at the same moment, the barrack began to shake. "They're bombing the Boona factory," someone shouted. I anxiously thought of my father who was at work, but I was glad nevertheless. To watch that factory go up in flames, what revenge! While we had heard some talk of German military defeats on various fronts, we were not sure if they were credible, but today this was real. We were not afraid, and yet if a bomb had fallen on the blocks, it would have claimed hundreds of inmates' lives. But we no longer feared death, in any event, not this particular death. Every bomb that hit filled us with joy, gave us renewed confidence. The raid lasted more than 1 hour. If only it could have gone on for 10 times 10 hours. Then, once more, there was silence. The last sound of the American plane dissipated in the wind, and there we were in our cemetery. On the horizon, we saw a long trail of black smoke. The sirens began to wail again, the end of the alert. Everyone came out of the blocks. We breathed in air filled with fire and smoke, and our eyes shone with hope. A block had landed in the middle of the camp, near the apple plots, the assembly point, but it had not exploded. We had to dispose of it outside of the camp. The head of the camp, the Lagertalisti, accompanied by his aide and by the chief capo, were on an inspection tour of the camp. The raid had left traces of great fear on his face. In the very center of the camp lay the body of the man with the soup stains on his face, the only victim. The cauldrons were carried back to the kitchen. The SS were back at their posts in their watchtowers behind their machine guns. Intermission was over. An hour later, we saw the commandos returning, in step as always. Happily, I caught sight of my father. Several buildings were flattened, he said, but the depot was not touched. In the afternoon, we cheerfully went to clear the ruins. 1 week later, as we returned from work, there in the middle of the camp, in the apple plots, stood a black gallows, and that's what's used to hang people. It's where nooses are. We learned that the soup would be distributed only after roll call, which lasted longer than usual. The orders were given more harshly than on other days, and there were strange vibrations in the air. "Caps off, the Lagertaliste suddenly shouted. 10,000 caps came off at once. Cover your heads. 10,000 caps were back on our heads at lightning speed. The camp gate opened. An SS unit appeared and encircled us. One SS every 3 paces. The machine guns on the watchtowers were pointed toward the apple plots. They're expecting trouble, whispered Juliet. 2 SS were headed toward the solitary confinement cell. They came back, and the condemned man between them. He was a young boy from Warsaw, an inmate with 3 years in concentration camp behind him. He was tall and strong, a giant compared to me. His back was to the gallows, his face turned toward his judge, the head of the camp. He was pale, but he seemed more solemn than frightened. His manacled or shackled, he's got handcuffs on. His manacled hands did not tremble. His eyes were coolly assessing the hundreds of SS guards, the thousands of prisoners surrounding him. The Lagertaliste began to read the verdict, emphasizing every word. In the name of Reichsfuhrer Himmler, prisoner number stole during the air raid, according to the law, prisoner number is condemned to death. Let this be a warning and an example to all prisoners. Nobody moved. I heard the pounding of my heart. The thousands of people who died daily in Auschwitz and Birkenau, in the crematoria, no longer troubled me. But this boy, leaning against the gallows, upset me deeply. This ceremony, will it soon be over? I'm hungry, whispered Juliet. At a sign of the Lagertaliste, the Lagercapo stepped up to the condemned youth. He was assisted by 2 prisoners in exchange for 2 bowls of soup. The capo wanted to blindfold the youth, but he refused. After what seemed like a long moment, the hangman put the rope around his neck. He was about to signal his aides to pull the chair from under the young man's feet when the latter shouted in a strong and calm voice, "Long live liberty! My curse on Germany! My curse! My..." The executioner had completed his work. Like a sword, the order cut through the air. Caps off! 10,000 prisoners paid their respects. Cover your heads! Then the entire camp, block after block, filed past the hanged boy and stared at his extinguished eyes, the tongue hanging from his gaping mouth. The capos forced everyone to look at him squarely in the face. Afterward, we were given permission to go back to our block and have our meal. I remember on that evening, the soup tasted better than ever. I watched other hangings, and I never saw a single victim weep. These withered bodies had long forgotten the bitter taste of tears, except once. The Oberkapo of the 52nd Cable Commando was a Dutchman, a giant of a man, well over 6 feet. He had some 700 prisoners under his command, and they all loved him like a brother. Nobody had ever endured a blow or even an insult from him. In his service was a young boy, a Pupel, as they were called. This one had a delicate and beautiful face, an incredible sight in this camp. In Buna, the Pupel were hated. They often displayed greater cruelty than their elders. I once saw one of them, a boy of 13, beat his father for not making his bed properly. As the old man quietly wept, the boy was yelling, "If you don't stop crying instantly, I will no longer bring you bread. Understood?" But the Dutchman's little servant was beloved by all. He was the face of an angel in distress. One day, the power failed at the central electric plant in Buna. The Gestapo, summoned to inspect the damage, concluded that it was sabotage. They found a trail. It led to the block of the Dutch Oberkapo. And after a search, they found a significant quantity of weapons. The Oberkapo was arrested on the spot. He was tortured for weeks on end. In vain, he gave no names. He was transferred to Auschwitz and never heard from again. But his young Pupel remained behind in solitary confinement. He too was tortured, but he remained silent. The SS condemned him to death, him and 2 other inmates who had been found to possess arms or guns. One day, as we returned from work, we saw 3 gallows, 3 black ravens, erected on the Appleplex. Roll call. The SS surrounding us, machine guns aimed at us, the usual ritual. 3 prisoners in chains, and among them the little Papel, the sad-eyed angel. The SS seemed more preoccupied, more worried than usual. To hang a child in front of thousands of onlookers was not a small matter. The head of the camp read the verdict. All eyes were on the child. He was pale, almost calm, but he was biting his lips as he stood in the shadow of the gallows. This time, the Lager Capo refused to act as an executioner. 3 SS took his place. The 3 condemned prisoners together stepped onto the chairs. In unison, their nooses were placed around their necks. "Long live liberty!" shouted the 2 men, but the boy was silent. "Where is merciful God? Where is he?" someone behind me was asking. At the signal, 3 chairs were tipped over. Total silence in the camp. On the horizon, the sun was setting. "Caps off!" screamed the Lager Teste. His voice quivered. As for the rest of us, we were weeping. "Cover your heads!" Then came the march past the victims. The 2 men were no longer alive. Their tongues were hanging out, swollen and bluish. But the 3rd rope was still moving. The child, too light, was still breathing. And so he remained for more than half an hour, lingering between life and death, writhing before our eyes. And when we were forced to look at him in close range. He was still alive when I passed him. His tongue was still red, his eyes not yet extinguished. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, "For God's sake, where is God?" And from within me, I heard a voice answer, "Where he is, this is where, hanging here from the gallows." That night, the soup tasted of corpses. Again, this was a really heavy reading today, guys, so be sure to reflect and think about and just really take in what all is happening in this reading. And as you're finishing up the questions, go ahead and open up your copies of the reading because you'll be using them to compare and contrast the 2 hangings and the words that Ella uses to describe each one of those. All right, best of luck.